Well, a few additional points that I want to make. Let me begin by a reference to Sigmund Freud. You probably know Sigmund Freud was the father of psychoanalysis, if you will. Okay. Sigmund Freud once chided his colleagues, saying, "The purpose of psychoanalysis is not to spin clever theories, but to help people." Okay. Similar approach to ethical theory may be helpful. Remember Socrates admonishing his colleagues, right, his friends and associates, that there is really only one terribly urgent and important question that we need to solve, and that is, how are we to live? So, similarly, when we look at ethical strategies, we want to ask ourselves, is this going to help us make actual real-world moral decisions? All right? Presumably, we can do better than simply deciding, shooting from the hip, deciding off the seat of our pants, and that's something that we've been talking about all semester. Okay. Few points in looking at Kant's absolutism. Okay, absolutism, it's just the opposite end of the spectrum of saying that it's all relative, all up for grabs. It's saying, nope, there are rules, and those rules are inviolable, and they are, as Kant would put it, a priori truths. So, absolutism has some strengths, but particularly in contemporary times, people would point out it has various weaknesses as well. And since Kant's ethics is most naturally construed as absolutism, then those strengths and weaknesses apply to Kant's ethics as well. Most people talking about Kant will spend a good deal of time talking about duty. Okay? Kant admonishes that we must do our duty simply because it is our duty, not because we want to, not because we hope to benefit from it, but because it is our duty. That's the only thing that is unequivocally good, is a good will. Well, what is a good will? A good will is the will to do what's morally right, just because it is right. Okay, is that problematic? Well, it is, because it's not always clear exactly what we should be doing, even if we want to do what is morally right. As we've seen with Socrates, a number of instances, duties may come into conflict with each other. Now, for Kant, duties, real moral duties, can't come into conflict with each other any more than principles of mathematics can come in conflict with each other. Actually, the 20th century would have a little bit of a different take on that as well. Okay, he is like one of his predecessors, the French philosopher René Descartes. He says, let's start with undoubtable truths and then see what we can deduce from them, and then we will have an unassailable edifice, fortress, Descartes calls it. We might give second thought to, as Sturba himself points out, the whole idea of using war as a paradigm for philosophy, particularly for ethics. Okay, I take a position, I defend that position against my adversaries, or I attack someone else's position, probe for weakness. When I find the weakness, then boom, full-fledged assault until I can tear it down. Then I'm king of the hill. But of course, others are circling me even as I'm doing that to try to do the same. Well, this is using warfare as a paradigm for philosophy, and I think Sturba is, to a large extent, correct in saying that's not the most helpful way to approach any topic. What about constructive dialogue? What about looking at your position and saying, here's what I can appreciate about it, here's what might be valuable, but here are, I think, some limitations and some suggestions for how we might get beyond those limitations. Okay, cooperative dialogue. Wow, what a novel idea, eh? Okay, goodwill, the will to do what's morally right just because it is right. That is, without worrying about consequences, without hope for gain, without taking my emotions or willingness to do my duty into account. Now, that might be helpful in some cases where we can see what really we ought to do, or what we think we ought to do, but we might have an emotional reluctance to do it. On the other hand, we might want to ask ourselves, why do we have that emotional reluctance? Is that necessarily a weakness? Or should we ask ourselves, are there additional considerations? Okay. So the case with the Euthyphro. Okay, I have a duty to uphold the law, but should I also have some emotional reluctance to prosecute my own father? Well, as I mentioned before, Confucius would have said, you're dealing with use an anachronism here, dealing with dynamite if you're saying that those basic primal relationships, such as parent to child, child to parent, that those are dispensable based on what society tells you you ought to do, or your particular moral commitments tell you you ought to do. Well, what about your commitment to your own family? Isn't that important? And isn't that as much a bedrock of our ability to live together humanely as any particular moral theory that we might hold? Okay, so what about mixed motives? Sometimes doing the right thing does not involve sacrifice. Sometimes doing what I've judged to be the right thing may also benefit me. Does that make it less morally worthy? When we look at Singer, we'll see that one of his objections to what we're going to study later, called ethical egoism, is that human beings frequently have a number of motives going on simultaneously. If I benefit from something, that doesn't mean that I'm doing it for the wrong reasons. If it's very cold in the room and I'm uncomfortable, and I also notice that you're very cold, I might say, okay, so we're all cold, let me turn up the temperature. Am I benefiting from that? Yeah, I intend to benefit from it. But do I also intend to benefit you? Yeah. Okay. It would seem to me that if you want to talk about human happiness as being a legitimate goal, and why not? I mean, we all seem to be hoping to be happy or happier, satisfied with our lives, then why should we discount emotional motives? Certainly, they are not by themselves persuasive because, I'll be a total heretic now for contemporary times, and people always say, follow your heart, tell yourself to shut up and just follow your heart. Really, the human heart is as capable of darkness and confusion as is the human intellect. So I prefer, as Alfred Adler put it, as I've quoted before, follow your heart, but take your brain with you. Okay, follow your heart without thinking it through leads to road rage, it leads to persecutions, it leads to lynch mobs, it leads to all kinds of things that, in fact, we would not find desirable. So, okay. Now, one should not act out of self-interest. Don't you have a moral duty to respect the interest of rational beings? Are you a rational being? As a person, do you have moral significance? Yeah. So if I am acting wrongly by treating you as an it, by treating you as merely a means to an end, am I not also doing wrongly if I treat myself as simply a means to an end? Well, my well-being doesn't matter. I should simply be an instrument of promoting some social goal or some promoting your well-being or something. Excuse me, don't I enter into the mix at all? When did I suddenly become devalued? Remember, Crito chides Socrates. You always say life is sacred. If life is sacred, so is your own. You can't just throw it away. So, some people have said that the absolutism of Kant is simply divine command ethics. Oh, that again. divine command ethics, but removing God from the driver's seat and putting reason in its place. Old-fashioned divine command ethics, and right, I've talked about the fact that there are improved alternatives, divine command made rational, if you will, or made humane. But old-fashioned divine command ethics would simply say, as I saw on one bumper sticker once, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Okay, you get your orders and you just salute smartly and you do what you're told to do. Which of course leads to the euthyphro problem of, you're choosing what it is you're going to accept as being the will of God and, saluting smartly. And there could be a number of contending and incompatible recommendations as to what the will of God would be. So, there's that traditional problem. Well, okay, so let's go totally secular on this. Let's take God out of the driver's seat and put reason in its place. And then we're going to sound more like Kant. Here are the dictates of reason. You can't worry about consequences. You can't worry about your own feelings. All you need to do is salute smartly and do what reason has told you to do. Excuse me, isn't it a little more complicated than that? Do we have divine command theory in structure, thus preserving many of the same difficulties that we found with divine command theory? It is entirely possible. Okay, if you look at your study guide, you'll see that one of the subheadings is deontology versus consequentialism. Quoting one of the excerpts that I had at the beginning of the course, it is probably safe to say that there is no single approach to moral reasoning that delivers the best outcome for all parties involved at all times. That's from the essay "You Care for Everyone: The Ethics of Cameron's Ethics of Care," by Renee Kyle in the anthology House and Philosophy. Okay. It is probably safe to say there is no single approach to moral reasoning that delivers the best outcomes for all parties involved at all times. We should keep that in mind as we study the difference between deontology and consequentialism. I don't know if you've ever seen the series Gotham, sort of the pre-story to the Batman mythology. The archvillain, the Riddler, is getting exasperated with some of his flunkies, and he says to them, I'd rather explain the difference between deontology and teleology to you than engage in this conversation. And of course, he doesn't, doesn't seriously mean he wants to explain to them the difference between deontology and teleology. But rather, it's just, my goodness, I'd rather engage in this arcane and complicated conversation than the conversation I'm engaging in now. Well, actually, you can make it much clearer than that quip would suggest. I mentioned that just because I was surprised. What is that reference popping up in this array like this? Well, okay, deontology comes from, look at your study guide, deontology, it has the word ontology in it. Okay, ontology is the branch of metaphysics dealing with what exists, what kinds of things exist. It comes from the Greek root onta, what is. The notion of deontology is that we should judge the moral fitness of an action just by looking at the action itself, the character of the action itself. Is this a virtuous kind of thing to do? Is this the right kind of thing to do? Based upon the moral precepts recommended to us by the categorical imperative test and the kingdom of ends test. Is this the kind of thing that I should do? Consequentialism says, we should judge the moral fitness of an action by its likely consequences. Give you an example. Supposing I have a friend who I know is on the brink of suicide because he thinks that no one's ever going to care for him. and he says to me, be honest with me. Do you think most people find me ugly and obnoxious? Well, what if I think the answer to that is yes? But I know he's edging toward suicide. Well, I cannot tell a lie. I must judge the moral fitness of my response by what kind of thing I'm doing, so I must tell the truth. Yeah, most people would find you unattractive and obnoxious. Okay, then he kills himself. Well, not my fault, I told the truth. A consequentialist would say, ask yourself what's the most likely outcome of what you're saying. What if I bend, twist, or shade the truth in such a way that I may be compromising the value of honesty, but I may be doing it for the sake of trying to save someone's life. Don't we do that all the time during, for instance, warfare? You lie to the enemy. Okay, we're going to talk later about situational ethics. One of the most common examples of situation ethics is, illustrations of situation ethics is, let's say you're living in Holland during World War II, the Nazis are occupying your country, and the Gestapo shows up at your door and says, we came to round up the Jews from this town, and they all seem to have left. Nobody seems to know where they might have gone to or to have seen them left. So we're just going door to door and asking everyone. You're thinking, okay, so they don't particularly suspect me. Do you know anything about where the Jews might have gone? Because we're going to round them up. What are you going to do then? Oh, we're going to kill them, obviously. Okay, now I'm hiding a Jewish family in my attic. If I have to say, I cannot tell a lie, that would be wrong. Lying is wrong. So, yes, I know where they went. Some of them are hiding in my attic, and others went to these places. And you hand over innocent lives. Okay, most people would say, are you kidding me? The consequences of telling the truth in this situation are horrible and devalue human life. They come into conflict with a larger moral issue. Okay, well, we'll return to that when we talk about situation ethics. The consequentialist says, you want to ask, is this right? Is this wrong? Ask yourself, what's the most likely outcome? So, of course, your beliefs have to involve a commitment to having evidence-based beliefs about facts. If I really care about whether what I'm doing is going to benefit others or harm others, I need to have the courage to look at the facts and not simply entertain notions of true or false based on my emotional pre-commitments. Okay. Interestingly, the time I'm making this, it's 2020. The current administration, and I believe it was 2018 or 19, issued an order to scientific agencies that are federally funded, federally managed, telling them that they must not use the phrase evidence-based when they publish their findings. They should simply say something to the effect of, based on our findings and in consideration of community standards. In other words, don't say anything that the community might find disagreeable, and don't cite it. Don't cite evidence, or don't point out that you're trying to base your conclusions on evidence. Okay, well, if you actually care about whether you're benefiting or harming people, you bloody well better care about evidence. So, we'll talk about consequentialism a great deal more when we talk about utilitarianism, which is coming up soon. But just understand, this is a different method of looking at how we should judge the moral fitness of an action. What's wrong with deontology? Well, the examples I've given illustrate some of the things that can go wrong with deontology. Remember, I have cited numerous times in talking about the Euthyphro and the Crito, Plato's example from Book 1 of the Republic of, I have borrowed a weapon from a friend, making a solemn promise I will return it to him on a particular date at a particular time, and in the interim the friend goes stark raving mad. What sensible person, says Socrates, what sensible person would say you're doing the right thing by keeping that promise and putting a weapon into the hands of a dangerous madman, or by telling him the strict truth? Okay. Now, those aren't random examples. Telling the truth, keeping your promises, doesn't that go right to the heart of deontology, to Kantian style ethics? No one could will to universalize the making of insincere promises, right? Well, what Plato seems to have suggested is that you have to take a lot more into consideration than just the abstract fitness of the action. Okay. Good intentions versus likely consequences. Okay. Well, moving on. Why are persons an end in themselves rather than merely a means? Remember, that's the heart of the kingdom of ends. You must never use any person merely as a means, but also always as an end. That is, morality must take into account the intrinsic value of human beings, the intrinsic value of persons. Actually, Kant says moral agents, but he also believes that human beings are the only moral agents, okay? Because we are the only ones capable of reason, or rational beings. We are the only rational agents, the only beings capable of reason outside of, say, God, are human beings. Okay, so just exactly who is a person in the sense of rational agents? Well, we're going to talk about that in the next topic, not this one, but I just want to raise the issue here. If our intrinsic moral value is based upon our ability to reason, are those who have greater ability to reason morally more significant? Are those who are rationally impaired or cognitively impaired less morally significant? I had to get the parrot out of something there. Are is, for instance, a Down syndrome baby worth less morally than a baby who is cognitively unimpaired? Okay, it's a very smart person, morally worth more than a not so smart person. Is a full-grown adult morally more significant than a child, or particularly than an infant? Okay, we will get into that next time under the next topic. Who is morally significant, and some of the answers that have traditionally been given have been, by contemporary standards, woefully incomplete or woefully biased. Okay. I won't begin talking about that now because you won't listen to another word Kant has to say. Okay, but and there are some good things. There are some things to get out of this. You remember the difference between something being valuable as a means? Again, in your study aids, I've recapped this. An instrumental good, something as good as a means, it means that I value it because of what I think it's going to get me. If we value anything as a means, we have to value something as an end. Something has to be valuable in its own right. Otherwise, it's all a series of means to nothing. If we value something as an end, we call that an intrinsic good. We value it for its own sake. Okay? Happiness is sometimes considered an intrinsic good. We value happiness for its own sake. For instance, if you say, why do you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning? You must really be an early bird. Oh, no, I hate getting up that early. Well, then why do you do it? Well, it's the only time I have to exercise. Oh, you must really love to exercise. No, actually, I don't, I don't enjoy it. Well, why do you do something you don't enjoy in order to do something else you don't enjoy? Because I think if I exercise, I'll live a longer, happier life, longer, healthier life. Well, why do you want to live longer and healthier? Well, because I think that will increase the amount of happiness I'll experience. Well, why do you want to be happy? At that point, I probably say, well, I want to be happy for the sake of being happy. Okay, so you see, there's an end. There's something I value for its own sake. Everything else, the getting up early, the exercising, the living longer and healthier, was all supposedly a means to greater happiness. Now, if someone could demonstrate to me that actually if you got that extra hour or 2 hours or whatever of sleep in the morning, that you would probably be happier in the end than if you make yourself get up early every morning. If someone could give me good evidence-based factual reasons for believing that, I would no longer have a reason to make myself get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay? So, a contemporary, that is 20th century philosopher named Parsons, I think, put it very, very well. He is something of a neo-Kantian. I think he would be comfortable with my characterizing him that way. If anything is valuable for its own sake, it has to, at the very least, be persons. The reason being that, nothing a human being does, nothing a human being accomplishes, nothing a human being creates, nothing a human being suffers, no human aspiration, no human misery, whatever, is significant unless humans are significant. So that indispensable premise for ethics seems to be the intrinsic value of persons. But that leads us to that question, who do we count as a person? Are there non-human rational agents? I will say, and we'll look at this again next time in greater depth, the more we know about animal cognition and animal neurology, that is non-human animals, because hello, we're primates, we are a human, and biologists classify us as a species of ape. We are primates, biologically. Whether you think there's an immortal soul that is, the essence of angels or whatever you believe, or an eternal Atman or whatever you believe, physically, biologically, we're primates, which means we're animals. Zorba the Greek, a great 20th century novel by Kazantzakis, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's a wonderful novel. It was made into a classic motion picture. Fantastic stage production was made of it. I was fortunate enough to see Anthony Quinn, who created the role of Zorba, in the stage production. But the one thing that was memorable to me is that Zorba's young companion, who is an American, at one point says to Zorba, "Look, I'm not an animal." And Zorba is totally blown away by that. He says, "Yes, you are an animal. If you don't realize you're an animal, you don't know anything." Okay, well, let's go the other way. How conscious, how much self-consciousness, how capable of suffering, how capable of enjoyment or pleasure or happiness or whatever are non-human animals? The answer would probably be some more than others, some very close to, say, human beings. Like a chimpanzee may be like a human toddler as far as their cognitive abilities are concerned. Birds, you'll see that sitting up there with the goddess Tara. Birds have very small brains, but it's been realized in recent years that the neurons are very, very densely packed, and they have particularly dense pack of neurons in where the two hemispheres meet, which means that they can do a disproportionately high amount of cognitive processing. Okay? Certain parrots have learned lots and lots of words. They seem to understand what those words mean because they can use them properly in the proper context, which is how we judge whether a human being understands language. So they can learn various tasks. Chimpanzees can make tools. We all know that. We're coming to realize that the octopus is cognitively much more sophisticated than we've given thought to before. So are there non-human animals whose suffering, whose well-being we ought to take into account? Well, we'll talk about that more when we talk about the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, because his answer was a resounding yes. He said the question is not, can they reason, can they speak, but rather, can they suffer? Okay, as I say, we'll return to that. There's a fallacy called false dichotomy, sometimes called black and white fallacy, sometimes called either or fallacy. So it's either this way or it's this way. Well, sometimes that is just an overly simplified way of thinking about problems. There are oftentimes matters of degree. Okay, matters of degree means that the dichotomy, the choice of either or, is misleading. Okay. Do you love me or do you hate me? Well, there are things I like about you, and there are things I don't like about you. No, do you love me or do you hate me? Well, wait a minute. It's not that simple. There's a film called Donnie Darko. In Donnie Darko, there is a scene where a teacher, a high school teacher who is very much into self-help stuff, is giving a lesson to the class, and it's based on something that was very trendy at one time. If it's not love, it's probably fear. And she's giving examples, then asking students in the class, would that be love or would that be fear? She said, well, for instance, supposing you found a wallet. There's money inside, but there's also an ID inside. Do you try to find the owner or do you keep it? Let's say you decided to keep it instead of finding the owner. Is that love or is that fear? She calls on the young man who's the protagonist of the film. He says, it's not that simple. Says, is it love or is it fear? It's not that simple. Is it love or is it fear? It's not that simple. Next scene, he's in the principal's office. He's being chided for being so insubordinate to the teacher. Well, of course, the irony is that he's quite right. That is an oversimplification. Vast oversimplification. Most of our actions have more complex motives. Circumstances have to be brought into consideration. Most of the time we're considering, is this the kind of person I want to be? Is this the kind of thing I want to do? Whether we bring that to the fore or not, to some extent determines our character. Yeah, I could do this and I'd enjoy it, but it wouldn't be right. And I don't want to be the kind of person who does this kind of stuff. Okay, or you know what? I don't care. I'm going to do it if I enjoy it or benefit from it. Okay, things are not simply, I'm doing it for this reason and no other reason. Generally, we have mixed motives. Okay, now there's also a consideration from informal logic called the Sorites paradox. Sorites paradox occurs when something changes into its opposite by degrees, not all at once. So you can see it's related. You don't have a dichotomy. You have changing by degrees. There are a number of books recently, one of which probably the best-selling one, most widely known one, is called How We Die, written by a physician. It's about how the human body dies, and of course most people realize it's not all at once. What has to happen before we actually declare you dead? Okay? Especially if the whole body doesn't die at once. At what point do we say we were simply reanimating a corpse rather than we are keeping a person alive? Because isn't personhood a complex concept? Okay? It's not enough to be biologically human to make you a person. You could be brain dead and still you're biologically human. Your corpse, you're still biologically human. Now that enters into all kinds of questions about end-of-life issues, if you will. So when we're talking about motives, we're talking about consequences, we're talking about the value of persons, we're talking about rather whether non-human animals have sufficient cognitive sophistication to be considered morally significant, we're probably going to run into the Sorites paradox again and again and again. How do you resolve a Sorites paradox? There's no clear natural place to draw the line. What you do is you say, why do I need to draw this line to begin with? What am I trying to accomplish? And what is the most useful place to draw that line in order to optimally accomplish the goals that led me to make this decision to begin with? Okay. Well, an example of that, I think it is a clear example of the Sorites paradox. Whether whatever side of this issue you fall on, and it shouldn't, why it should even be sides. But the issue of reproductive rights, as they're called, or if you will, the right to have a safe and legal abortion. When the case of Roe v. Wade was argued before the Supreme Court, the attorneys for Jane Roe, which is that's like John Doe. It's you want to maintain the privacy of the person, so you just use that as a generic placeholder. Well, Jane Roe's attorneys argued previously the Supreme Court has decided that the right of a state to regulate the sexual behavior of its citizens is not absolute, and that citizens are entitled to medical privacy, okay, or personal privacy. Okay, now that case that was being cited was a case striking down Connecticut's laws against artificial birth control. Yeah, at one time we try to get people to use condoms now, right? And at one time it was actually illegal to do so in Connecticut. And actually, during my lifetime, using artificial birth control of any kind was considered was illegal. Why? Well, it's unnatural. Well, says who? Human beings have used all kinds of birth control for centuries, which is one reason why for the persecution of the midwives in medieval Europe. But okay, the Supreme Court had decided the states have always had the power to regulate the sexual behavior of their citizens, but that right has never been absolute. It has to be balanced against the right of privacy, of private personal conduct. Okay. Now, in Roe v. Wade, the attorneys for Roe cited that precedent and said, we're using the same logic that was used in this case to say a woman is entitled to make her own medical choices about her own body. And of course, those wanting to uphold the anti-abortion laws were saying, but you see, it isn't just about the woman's body, it's also about the life of a baby. And the Supreme Court's decision, the Roe v. Wade decision, was, I think, an extremely well-reasoned and balanced decision. Whether you think they could have done better or not, you're entitled to your opinion on that. But it's a good illustration of using Weston's right versus right in the case of a Sorites paradox. They begin the majority opinion by saying, philosophers, theologians, scientists have argued for centuries. How exactly should you define personhood? What defines a person? What, if you will, is the intention? Remember that from Freud, the intention of the term person. Because the court does have an obligation to protect the lives of innocent persons. But at what point does the fetus become no longer merely part of the woman's body, but also a person in its own right, and therefore entitled to protections under law? You know what? It doesn't happen all at once. Okay, if you have Bronze Age beliefs that, the soul, kind of like a paratrooper, comes out of heaven, alights in the woman's womb at the moment of conception, then, basically you've turned it into a false dichotomy. Aristotle believed that you were a person at the point of conception because he seems to have believed in reincarnation and thought that's the most likely time for the soul to actually enter into its physical vehicle. Well, as the French philosopher I mentioned before, René Descartes, often pointed out, you can't use less certain premises to prove an uncertain conclusion. Your evidence has to be more certain, less controversial than your conclusion, or else it can't work as evidence. It can't do the purpose of evidence. So, the court's decision was, since this is obviously, they didn't use the term Sorites paradox, but they described a Sorites paradox and said this happens by degrees. What we want to do, we're going to have to draw the line and say, you know what? We have two perfectly legitimate interests here. One is the woman's right to medical privacy and sovereignty over her own body, because let's face it, if you don't have sovereignty over your own body, you don't have any freedom at all. And the other is the legitimate interest of preventing infanticide. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw the line here. We're going to say, up until the end of the second trimester, the fetus shall be considered, for legal purposes, essentially a part of the woman's body, and the states may not pass laws restricting elective abortion up through the end of the second trimester. After the end of the second trimester, the states may pass laws restricting elective abortion, but not when the health or life of the woman is at risk, because that would essentially be saying, the woman's worth less than the child is, and the law has no right to do so. Okay, so the takeaway from that, deciding who is morally significant. We're going to dedicate the whole next session to that. The decision of who is morally significant and in what sense and why may be far more complex than we necessarily realize. Another case in point, Terri Schiavo. You probably don't even know that name anymore. At the time, there was a huge national hubbub about a woman named Terri Schiavo in Florida. She had been on life support for a decade. She had been declared brain dead. But after your brain is dead and doesn't have any realistic prospect, and this is not a coma, okay? Yes, sometimes people do come out of a coma. If your brain is literally dead, then there's virtually no reason to hope that the doctors have missed anything and you're actually going to come back. Terri Schiavo had been on life support, brain dead, for a decade. And the sonograms the doctors were doing were showing that her brain was actually beginning to liquefy. You can get that, it's rotting inside her skull. It's liquefying. At that point, the husband said, "No, pull the plug. Pull the plug." And this is grotesque. This is, my wife is gone. She's dead. She's never going to be brought back. Pull the plug. And under Florida law, the spouse is entitled to make that decision. The parents of Terri Schiavo, however, threw a fit and said, "No, she's not dead. Look, when I recite the Lord's Prayer to her, she twitches. That means that she can hear it." No, that means, it's like you're running electricity through a cadaver, it's going to twitch. No, they just you have to feel some compassion for them. They so desperately wanted to believe that she might come back to life, that they were having such a hard time accepting that she was dead, that they were essentially engaging in fantasy, grasping at straws. Well, they tried to go to court to stop the husband from pulling the plug. And the court decided in favor of the husband and said, "Look, under Florida law, the parents don't have any standing in this decision. It's the spouse's decision." So then Florida Governor Jeb Bush, whose brother George W. Bush was president at the time, issued an executive order to delay pulling the plug. Why? Well, he asked his brother, George W. Bush, who was president, to call Congress back into session to pass a special law protecting Terri Schiavo's so-called life, right? Essentially preventing pulling the plug on Terri Schiavo. Congress wasn't willing to go along with it. Something like, according to the polls that were taken, 80% of the American people said the government should stay out of this. But Jeb Bush, why did Jeb Bush do such a thing? Well, the opinion was pretty much unanimous. He was hoping to run for president, which he did. Campaigned very badly, didn't get off the ground. He was hoping to run for president. He needed to make himself into a national figure. Here was a chance to do it. I swear everyone and his sister showed up in Florida to get in front of a camera to give their take on this whole thing. And what a circus. And really how disrespectful. So now, why would he want to make himself a national figure this way? Because he knew that the people who are anti-abortion, who are basically single-issue voters, go to the polls in astronomically high percentages. Virtually, nearly 100% of them go to the polls, and even if they are the minority, I learned this when I was a teenager. We're doing precinct work for various candidates. You don't have to have the majority in a precinct to carry the precinct. You just have to have the majority of people who actually get to the poll and vote. So, see how complex and politically charged this whole issue is? Based on false dichotomy, based on either-or thinking. Okay? So, we will return to that issue when we discuss our next topic, who is morally significant. Now, I want to talk about something called situation ethics. I want to talk about it as a model for decision making. Okay, because I think that's what's most important to us as a takeaway from a moral issues class, is not some arcane theoretical notions that you're probably going to forget a few weeks after the class, but rather some practical considerations about making real-world moral decisions. And that's essentially how situational ethics was born. A man named Fletcher, who was a clergyman, wrote a book called Ethics in the Situation, which is the kickoff for that whole movement in ethics. But the origin was soldiers who were returning from World War I. Okay, World War I was horrific. The world had never seen anything like it before. And, it was trench warfare, just, people fighting like toe to toe, like an ancient battle. And it was awful. And people who were conscripted to fight in World War I, many of these were, we were still largely an agrarian country. So people were, farm boys, thousands of farm boys. They had not seen the world. They did not have this kind of worldview of, how violent and horrific the world could be. And many of them were fundamentalist Christians. Fundamentalism meant something different at that time. Fundamentalists at the turn of the century, like all fundamentalists, believe that there is some doctrine, some scripture, some teacher we should be following as exactly as possible. But fundamentalists around the turn of the century believed, well, we have to take literally the teachings of Jesus. We have to care for the poor. We have to feed the hungry. We have to care for those who are ill. We have to welcome the immigrant. We have to do all those things that Jesus told us to do. Okay? And, gee, isn't there a commandment against killing? Actually, by the way, no, there isn't. Commandment, which gets translated in the King James Version, thou shalt not kill. Actually, the Hebrew term only applies to unauthorized killing or unjustified killing. Thou shalt not kill never applied to self-defense or to soldiers in warfare. It was never intended to do that. The ancient Israel did engage in warfare, which they thought was divinely sanctioned, against various Semitic neighbors. So, thou shalt not kill. How could you even enforce that, but at the same time you believe God is telling you to make war on other people? So, and the death penalty was still enacted against certain kinds of very heinous crimes. So, but if you believe very literally that you were commanded, thou shalt not kill, and that your duty was to, your chief moral duty was to imitate Jesus and follow his commands, how could you possibly reconcile that with all you had been through and all you had to do during the war? And many people were coming back from the war and having what we would call PTSD. At the time, they would have called it a moral crisis or a psychological crisis. Now, we live in a very highly psychologized society, right? If you go into Northampton, for instance, which is a stone's throw from where I live, Northampton, Mass. If you go into Northampton, you can't turn around without tripping over some therapist of some kind. Okay, there are all these different therapeutic modalities available, and virtually everyone's got a shingle hanging out. I'm this or that kind of therapist. Didn't exist at that time in our culture. So when people needed counseling, when they needed what we would call psychological counseling or the psychotherapy, by and large, they turned to their clergy. And many clergymen were finding themselves unable to deal with the crisis before them. As late as the 1970s, I met one minister who was this was in a counseling workshop. A minister was taking the counseling workshop, and he said, I am taking this counseling workshop because I have many people in my flock, in my congregation, who come to me with problems that are clearly psychological problems. I'm not trained to do that. And I could tell people have faith in Jesus or whatever, but if the person commits suicide in the meantime, that kind of limits the options, doesn't it? So I better at least know when to recognize the symptoms of a serious mental disorder and get that person to the right kind of professional. So I thought that was very, very highly responsible of him. But okay, so what did Fletcher do? Fletcher said, look, there will be times when moral principles come into conflict with each other. Okay, Plato, Socrates seem to think that that was possible from the various examples we've looked at earlier. Kant seems to think that that can't possibly happen. A real duty can't come into conflict with another real duty any more than the axioms of mathematics can conflict with one another, or the axioms of logic can conflict with one another. Take my intro course and you'll discover that. Uh-oh. Anyway, so what Fletcher said was, and this is, you can whether Fletcher was consciously influenced by the Credo or not, you can see the seeds of this in the Credo. You have to decide what your most fundamental values are, your core values. And then when you make particular circumstances and particular decisions in particular circumstances, you have to let your core values be your compass. Okay? So you see Socrates saying, yes, I have a duty to the law, and it is a sacred duty, it's an important duty, but I have a greater duty to my conscience and the gods as I understand them. So if I'm in a situation where one value has to yield, the more fundamental value is the one that's going to take precedence. Okay? Now that doesn't mean the other value goes away. Let's use a concrete example. As I mentioned before, let's say you're living in Holland during World War II. The Gestapo comes to your door and says, we're hunting down the Jews, and they all seem to have left. We're just asking everybody, going door to door, asking everybody, do you know anything about where they might be hiding or where they might have gone? And you're hiding a Jewish family in your attic. Now, you may believe strongly that honesty is a very important bedrock value. You may believe, along with Kant, you should never make an insincere promise. But these are extraordinary circumstances, and are you going to make an exception and say, no, I have no idea, those, and act as if you hate the Jews, those damn Jews, that figures that they would sneak out of town. You know what, if I hear anything at all, I promise that I will tell you. And the better a liar you are, the more convincing you are as a liar, the more likely you are to actually save those human lives. Now, is it because the need to tell the truth and the need to never make an insincere promise has gone away? No, it's been overridden in a particular situation, in those particular circumstances, because there is an even more fundamental value that takes precedence. That is the need to protect innocent human life. Alrighty. This is, by the way, this is one of the issues that split the American Baptist Church into two warring congregations, the so-called fundamentalist or Southern Baptist congregation and the so-called moderate or regular Baptist congregation. At a convention in the 1950s, there were basically three issues that tore the Baptist Church into two separate congregations that have never reunited. One was evolution. Okay, well, that's a surprise, huh? The fundamentalists said, no, Genesis must be interpreted literally, evolution must be false. And the moderate Baptists said, any religious person with an education understands that there is overwhelming evidence for evolutionary science. That's the position of the Vatican. The position of the Vatican is that there is overwhelming evidence for that evolution takes place and that evolutionary science is legitimate science. In fact, the Vatican's position for over half a century has been we would be hypocrites if we rejected evolution and said it's bad science while accepting all other science that is sometimes not even as well evidenced. But on the other hand, Genesis is also true. Which means, since truth can't contradict truth, they must be saying different things. Genesis perhaps is best read as a parable. Okay? We spend a lot of time talking about the importance of parables and mythics and things and so forth in my world religions course. As Weston says, let the stories be stories. They have instructive power if they are stories. When you start taking them literally, there's something rather malicious about them, because you have to start denying evidence. You have to start trying to enforce things that you probably know aren't true. As Mark Twain put it, faith is when you decide to believe something that you know ain't true. Well, of course, that's at the very lowest level. That's one version of it. But that's not the only thing that faith can mean. Faith can also mean, having, embracing your most authentic experiences and so forth. But that's a topic for another course. Situation ethics simply acknowledges what Socrates often indicated. Doing the same thing under radically different circumstances is not going to produce the same results. Okay? We've all heard it attributed to Einstein. I don't know whether he actually said these words. Doing the same thing in the same way and expecting different results is madness. Well, Socrates said something that's actually kind of the mirror image of that, but also true. The two are completely compatible. They dovetail very nicely. What Socrates indicated on a number of occasions is, if you do the same thing in the same way under radically different circumstances, you can't expect the same results. And if indeed you're not a deontologist, you're a consequentialist, or you judge the moral fitness of an action by its likely ends, or at least in part, then you're going to say, under different circumstances, my duties are going to differ. Normally, my day-to-day work, my day-to-day relationships, telling the truth, not killing, keeping promises, those things are important parts of what holds civil society together, whether it's personal relationships or social relationships. In times of war, I may have to violate all those rules. Why? Because I'm trying to stop a much greater evil from taking place, or trying to correct a much greater evil. Well, how do you know what the greater evil is? Again, I think Fletcher's hit it right on the head. You have to define in advance what are my most fundamental, my core values, and use that as your compass. Now, situation ethics fell out of favor academically in the 1970s, and one of the reasons for that was it didn't satisfy many of the things that people wanted a theoretical ethics to do. They wanted to be consistent, to be all-encompassing, to clarify this, that, and the other thing. That no, this was simply a tool, never meant to be anything other than a tool for actually helping people make humane decisions in morally significant circumstances. That's why I began with Sigmund Freud chiding his colleagues, the purpose of psychoanalysis is to help people, not to spin clever theories. I think that as far as how most people make real-life moral decisions, situation ethics has captured something very practical and very real about that, and deserves closer examination. Another reason that situation ethics sort of interest dwindled was because Fletcher was a Christian, and he spent a lot of time talking about the proper interpretation of Christian love, and for many ethicists, that's simply that's not an issue in their purview. That is for theologians to discuss, and if you're pursuing a secular ethics, it didn't seem to be terribly useful. Well, actually, I think it probably is useful to discuss what the term love means. Later in the course, we're actually going to do that. The term love in contemporary English is so ambiguous, it can mean any number of things. You love pizza, you love your children, you love God, you love this, that, and the other thing. Everything from simple appetite to a sort of a selfless, almost mystical um, union with the other. That could be, you know, the term of love is just so vague. If someone says "I love you," do you know what they mean? I mean, it doesn't sound a little odd to say. If someone says "I love you," to say, "What do you mean by that?" But on the other hand, our failure to do that can lead to all kinds of avoidable suffering. Um, well, as I say, actually, when we get to ethical egoism, we'll talk about exactly that topic. Um, a student of mine who was himself very religious once said that one of the things that I said about the notion of love in the world religions class was extremely helpful to him. As I put it, was if you say you like something, you're setting an expectation for how it's going to make you feel. If you say you love something, at least in the sense of that it's used within Christianity and various other religious traditions or ethical traditions, if you say you love someone, you're setting an expectation on yourself about how you're going to treat them. Okay? Okay, I'm going to treat you with a respect and a compassion and a consideration for your value as a person. It's very different from saying I like you. Right? And Kant certainly acknowledges that when he says, um, whether or not I like you shouldn't enter into how I treat you. I should treat you fairly. I shouldn't give you special advantages because I like you, or special disadvantages because I don't like you. I should treat you fairly because as a person you're entitled to that. Well, I don't think that Fletcher's conception of love is terribly different from that. But he says, look, as a Christian clergyman, love, as I understand it, Christian love, as I understand it, that is a respect for and a compassion for other persons should be my guiding compass. I think that is a very useful takeaway from the whole discussion of situation ethics. Okay, now I have linked up an article from the BBC actually about situation ethics, which is pretty much, it's pretty simplistic, but I think it's worth looking at. And I find that actually, while many courses on philosophical ethics looking at this point discuss situation ethics at all, that my students very often find it one of the most helpful things that we discuss. Okay, and that doesn't mean I can simply take it whole cloth from what Fletcher said, but it's the useful consideration of defining core values, of realizing duties can come into conflict, of how you make decisions when duties are in conflict, and that goes all the way back to the Credo. This is not some sort of, you know, flash in the pan trendy thing. Um, okay, particularly when the article is noting the bad points of situation ethics. A lot of times those criticisms, I think, criticisms are kind of beside the point. It excludes most universal moral truths, um, seems to remove any possibility of guaranteeing universal human rights. Well, no, that mistakes situation ethics for um, what we might call naive relativism, right? To do situation ethics, you have to define core values to begin with, and those core values are supposed to be humane. All right. It's not clear what love means. Well, that's spent a great deal of time discussing it, and yes, I would agree. You can't have something like love as your core value. You could do situation ethics without love being your core value, but if it is, yes, you do need to discuss it. I mean, yeah, and is it clear what it means? Well, I think Fletcher makes it pretty clear what he means, and I think within various traditions, it's pretty clear what it means. In the ordinary contemporary English, is it clear what it means? No, not at all. Which is why we need to discuss it. Difficult to implement. Good Lord. what ethical theory is not difficult to implement? And is the difficulty of implementing it, is that an argument for it because it recognizes the moral complexity of the world we live in? Can't produce consistent results? Yeah, I beg to differ. If you're taking particular circumstances into consideration as a part of your decision making, the idea is to have consistent results, that you make decisions based upon fairness and based upon compassion, and that you do that as consistently as possible. That's what you're aiming for: compassion, kindness, fairness, justice, in the sense of fairness. And that may call for different kinds of behavior in different kinds of situations. It may approve of evil acts. Well, that's an argument against consequentialism, and we'll talk about that more when we look at utilitarianism, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. And in fact, there are ways to deal with that. There are ways of saying, one of the most important things I need to do is to have rules that I will observe whether I want to observe them or not. That may be inconvenient in some circumstances, but I cannot violate those rules except if there is an additional overriding moral consideration, which is exactly what Socrates says at his trial. Okay, so for your consideration, lots to think about. Really, the emphasis again is on whether and how we're going to be able to make better real-world moral decisions.